The cold that settled over Billings, Montana on the third Thursday of November wasn't the kind you dressed for. It was the kind that got into walls. Caleb Rourke had been driving north on Route 87 for 2 hours with the heater running and still felt it in his knuckles. In the passenger seat, Scout lifted his head. Then he stood up, which he never did on a moving road. Through the windshield, lit by the last of the afternoon's gray light, Caleb could see the house at the end of the gravel drive, his mother's house. And something was wrong with every inch of it. What Caleb Rourke and his canine uncovered that evening would expose a secret buried behind the door of a place that had been calling itself a home while doing something very different inside. If you're new to this channel, stay with me through this one, and subscribe so you're here for what follows. There are more stories worth telling. Caleb had joined the Marines at 19 for a reason that had nothing to do with glory. His father, Earl Rourke, had worked the same oil company job in the Bakken for 16 years, and one winter morning, in a field 40 miles from anyone who could help him, a pressure line gave out. The company sent flowers. Caleb was 17. He stood in the kitchen of that house on Route 87 and watched his mother read the card attached to them and say nothing for a very long time. He understood then that the world was not arranged fairly and that some people had to make themselves useful enough to push back. He signed the papers 2 years later. 2 deployments, Helmand Province first, then the eastern border near Paktika. He didn't talk about either one in any detail, not even to the men he served with, except sometimes late at night when the temperature dropped and the silence had a particular weight, and they would say things to each other they would never repeat in daylight. He came back the first time with most of himself intact. He came back the second time with something missing behind his eyes that he couldn't name. He drove long hauls now, Montana to Wyoming, sometimes down into Colorado, because the road required just enough attention to keep the other thoughts from getting too loud, and because Scout, who rode beside him without complaint through every mile, was the steadiest company he'd ever had. Scout was a Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, 72 pounds of lean muscle and a coat the color of autumn wheat that darkened to black along his muzzle and ears. He had been trained for patrol work and then placed with Caleb through a veteran partnership program run out of Missoula, and in the 8 months since, he had done something Caleb hadn't expected. He had made the silences livable. When Caleb came back from a dream that wasn't quite a dream and sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, Scout would come out of whatever room he'd been sleeping in and sit beside the chair without being called. He would not press. He would not leave. He would simply be there, close enough to touch, until morning decided to show up. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Caleb's mother, Irene Rourke, was 89 years old and had lived in that house off Route 87 for 53 years. She had raised 3 children in it, put 2 through college, buried a husband, outlasted 2 neighbors, repainted the porch 4 times, and kept a garden along the south fence that the whole road knew about from the first week of June through the last week of September. Tomatoes mostly, sweet corn in the back row. She had a way with soil that other people in the county had driven out to observe and could not replicate, and she knew it without needing to say so. Irene Rourke was a woman who set her own table and did not ask for help, and had, as far as anyone on that road had known for 53 years, not needed to. Her husband Earl had been gone for 22 years. She had carried that without drama, the way women of her generation carried losses, practically putting one foot in front of the other until the foot placement became habit, and habit became the shape of a life. She still set 2 places at the kitchen table in the mornings. She had done it for 22 years without being asked why. She would not have answered if someone had. The moment she became truly alone happened on a Tuesday in late January, 4 years ago, when her daughter Sandra, the middle child, the one who called every Sunday, called to say she was moving to Portland with her husband and that she'd arranged something. She'd found someone to help, a nephew of a neighbor of hers, who could check in on Irene, do the heavy things around the property, make sure she didn't need anything. His name was Derek. Irene had said thank you. She had set the phone down carefully. She had stood at the kitchen window for a long time looking at the garden, which was buried under January snow and would not be herself again until June. She had not asked for help. She had not needed it noted. She still remembered who she was, and that woman, the one who had put 2 children through college and kept a garden that people came to see, did not advertise her difficulty. She would manage. She had always managed. She would not have called Caleb. He was driving his routes, living his silences, managing his own weight. She would not have told him about the cold coming in under the back door, or the phone she kept in her bedroom that sometimes wasn't where she'd left it, or the particular sound of Derek's truck in the gravel that had started somewhere in the last 8 months, to make her feel something she did not have a comfortable word for. Caleb had not been to the house since August. 5 months. A long stretch. He knew it. He had told himself he would come in September, then October, and the months had moved the way months move when a man is driving roads and keeping the thoughts quiet. He was going now because a woman in his mother's church, a woman named Ruth, who sang in the choir and had known Irene for 30 years, had called him. She had called him twice, actually. He hadn't answered the first time. He answered the second time at a truck stop outside Roundup on a gray November afternoon. And what Ruth had said was not alarming in the way that emergency calls are alarming. It was quieter than that. She'd said, "I don't know how to say this exactly. I just think you should go and see her. There's something, I don't know. Just go." He had driven north. Scout stood in the passenger seat and would not sit down. His ears were forward and his body was rigid with something that wasn't alarm and wasn't excitement. It was the third thing, the one that meant he had already decided something before Caleb had finished looking. Caleb pulled the truck onto the gravel drive and killed the engine. The house looked wrong the way a face looks wrong when the expression doesn't match the occasion. The lights were on, one in the kitchen, one in the back. The porch had something on it that hadn't been there in August. Bags, cardboard boxes, things in black trash bags, stacked against the railing on the far end. Caleb sat for a moment and looked at them. Then he got out of the truck. Scout was already at his side before his boots hit the gravel. He knocked. Then he opened the door the way he always had, the way you do when it's your childhood home and you are expected. His mother was sitting at the kitchen table. She looked up when he came in and something crossed her face that he had never seen on her face before, something that started like relief and then became, very quickly, something more controlled. She was thinner. The dress she wore was loose across the shoulders in a way it wouldn't have been last summer. "I was going to call you," she said. "I know," Caleb said. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Scout moved into the kitchen ahead of him, stopped, and turned toward the hallway that led to the back rooms. He stood very still. "He's just looking around," Caleb said and watched his dog. Scout walked to the hallway and stopped at the second door. The back bedroom, the one that had been the guest room, the one that had held his father's things for years after the funeral, before Irene had quietly, over several months, donated most of them to the church. The door was shut. Scout sat in front of it. He did not move. Caleb looked at his mother. "That door locked?" A pause. One beat too long. "It's just, Derek keeps his things in there. Supplies, he says. Tools. The guest room. He's been fixing things." She smoothed the front of her dress. "He's been very helpful." "Open it for me," Caleb said. Another pause. "I don't have a key." Caleb looked at his mother for a long moment. She was looking at the table. He stood, walked to the door, and tried the handle. Locked. He looked at the door frame. The lock was new, newer than the handle, the wrong hardware for the door, the wrong era entirely, a silver mechanism on a frame that had been painted 4 or 5 times in 50 years, the old layers showing at the edges. His mother was still at the table. She had her hands folded in a particular way he had not seen before. He came back and sat down. "Tell me about Derek," he said. She told him the version she had been telling. Sandra arranged it. "He came in November of last year. He'd done good work early on. The back steps, the gutter on the south side, some plumbing under the kitchen sink. He was Sandra's neighbor's nephew," she repeated. "A good person. Things were fine." She talked for a while. She talked the way people talk when they have rehearsed something, when they have convinced themselves that the rehearsed version is the same as the true version. Caleb listened without interrupting. He watched her hands. He watched the way she described Derek carefully and evenly, and never once used a word that contained real feeling. Then she reached, without thinking, toward the counter beside the stove, a short automatic gesture, the kind you make for a phone or your keys, and stopped. Her hand hung there for a moment. Then she put it back in her lap. "Where do you keep your phone, Mom?" She looked at the counter. "I think I left it in the other room." "When did you last use it?" A breath. "I'm not sure." Caleb sat back. He had been in enough situations, in enough places, where the gap between what a person said and what was actually true had mattered enough to cost lives. And he had developed a particular stillness for those moments. Not coldness, but something more like the quiet a man finds when he stops spending energy on his own reactions and puts it all toward listening. He was doing that now. He heard the rehearsed story. He saw the locked door. He saw the dress that didn't fit right. He saw the hand that reached for something that wasn't there. What Caleb Rourke understood in that kitchen was the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself all at once. He stayed for dinner. He said nothing about the door. He helped his mother with the dishes. He slept on the living room couch with Scout on the floor beside him. And at some point before morning, Scout stood up, walked to the hallway, and sat in front of the locked door again. Caleb watched him in the dark. Then he lay back down. He was not going to leave. The next morning, the truck came up the gravel drive at 8:15. Caleb was at the kitchen table. He heard his mother's breathing change before he heard the engine. Have you ever known someone too proud to say they needed help? Someone who would carry a thing for years before asking? If that person is still in your life, call them after this. If they're not, tell me about them in the comments. They deserve to be remembered. Derek Holt was 43 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the posture of a man accustomed to being larger than the people around him. He had a friendliness to his face that arrived quickly and was slightly too practiced, the kind of smile that does the work a smile is supposed to do without any of the warmth behind it. He came in through the back door the way he always came in, which was to say he came in without knocking. He stopped when he saw Caleb. "Didn't know Irene had company," he said. Scout, who had been lying under the kitchen table, stood up. He moved out from under the table and positioned himself between Derek and Irene without being told. His ears were back. The sound that came from him was low and continuous. Not a bark, not an alarm. A decision already made, waiting on a reason. Derek looked at the dog. Something in his smile recalibrated. "I'm Caleb," Caleb said. "Her son." "Right," Derek said. "She talks about you." He looked at the boxes on the porch through the window. "I was going to talk to Irene about some of those things out front. Some of the old furniture. There's a man in Billings who takes things, and we've been going through what she doesn't use anymore." Irene was looking at the table. "We can talk about that," Caleb said. "Sit down." He had the manner of a man who was doing someone a favor by complying. He talked about the property, the maintenance, the things he'd fixed. He mentioned casually that the back bedroom had been converted to a storage space for his equipment, which he needed on site for the work which was ongoing, which was a lot to manage given the age of the structure and the difficulty of getting to town in winter. He talked as though he were explaining something to someone who didn't quite understand how things worked. Caleb let him finish. Then his mother spoke. She had been quiet through all of it. She spoke in the way she always spoke, directly, precisely, without waste. But it was not the rehearsed thing. It came out the way water comes through a crack. He took the pills on Tuesdays. The kitchen went still. Derek's hand, which had been resting easily on the table, went motionless. He looked at Irene, then he looked at Caleb. Irene was looking at the table. She hadn't meant to say it, perhaps, or she had meant to for longer than anyone in that room could know. The sentence hung there, specific and small and impossible to unhear. Caleb knew immediately what it meant. The medication management was not care. It was control. The pills were leverage. The schedule was Derek's schedule, not her doctor's. Scout had not moved. He stood between Derek and Irene, and when Derek shifted slightly in his chair, the dog's growl dropped half a tone, which meant exactly what it sounded like. Caleb looked at Derek for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was the voice he had learned in places where the wrong register cost everything. Low, unhurried, carrying the weight of someone who had already decided. "I need you to understand something," he said. "There's a document at the pharmacy on 2nd that lists the prescribing instructions for her blood pressure medication. The timing is on the label. The pharmacist, whose name is Mr. Okafor, is expecting my call this morning. He's already spoken with her GP." A pause. "I have her phone. I found it in the storage room, in the back bedroom, on the top shelf." It had been turned off. He set the phone on the table. "The phone has texts on it, from my sister Sandra, from Ruth Connolly, from her doctor's office. None of them were answered. I've read them." Derek opened his mouth. "I'm not finished." Caleb said. He was not finished. He described the lock on the guest room door, the hardware, the age of it, the fact that his mother did not have a key to a room in her own home. He described the items on the porch, the furniture that was being prepared for removal. He described what he'd seen when Scout had found the unlocked back window of that room the evening before. The mail, stacked and unopened, going back to September. 3 months of statements. An envelope from the county assessor, a form with his mother's signature on it dated October 7th, with a section highlighted in yellow related to a quitclaim deed. Ruth Connolly was sitting in the living room. She had arrived at 7:30 at Caleb's request, before Derek's truck came up the drive. She had brought the pastor of their church, a man named Harold Briggs, who had a son in the Navy and understood without needing it explained exactly what was being asked of him in being present. They were witnesses. They had heard the name on the deed. They had seen the unsigned section. They had heard the sentence about the pills. The county sheriff's department would arrive within the hour. The quitclaim form was not completed and would not be. The storage room was opened, inventoried, and photographed. The items on the porch came back inside. Derek Holt stood and looked at Caleb for a moment, the full posture of a man who has miscalculated. And then he walked toward the back door. Scout watched him go. The dog did not relax until the door latched behind him. Then Scout walked back to Irene's chair and sat beside it. She put her hand on the top of his head. She didn't say anything. If you were in Caleb's position right now, having seen exactly what he had seen, would you have done the same thing? Be honest with yourself. Type yes or no below. I read every comment. What happened in the weeks that followed moved through the Billings community the way certain things do, quietly and then all at once. The sheriff's office referred the case to Adult Protective Services. The quitclaim form was reviewed and found to have been presented under circumstances that the county attorney described in a hearing in late December as coercive and without informed consent. Derek Holt's arrangement with the property was formally dissolved. He did not contest it. Ruth Connolly organized a rotation of visitors from the church, not as charity, but as company. The distinction mattered to Irene, and Ruth understood this without being told. People came to talk and have coffee and leave when they were supposed to. The pastor brought his wife, who had known Earl Rourke years ago and had stories about him that Irene hadn't heard, and they sat at the kitchen table for an afternoon in the second-place setting. Didn't feel as empty as it sometimes did. Sandra flew in from Portland for Christmas. She sat with Caleb at the kitchen table after their mother had gone to bed and didn't say much for a long time. Then she said, "I should have listened to Ruth when she called the first time." Caleb said, "Yes, that was the whole of it. It was enough." There are moments that feel less like coincidence and more like arrangement. Caleb had almost not answered Ruth's second call. He had been tired, and the road had been long, and he had told himself he would go in December. It had been November. Those 4 weeks might have been enough time for a document to be signed, for a process to reach a point of no return. He did not like thinking about that. He thought about it anyway, the way veterans think about the things that almost went differently, not to punish himself, but to stay honest about how close the margins are. The back bedroom was returned to what it had always been. Irene put fresh linens on the bed. She set Earl's photograph, which she had found in the stack of mail on the top shelf, tucked into an envelope, which was where Derek had put it, back on the shelf in the hallway, where it had lived for 22 years. Scout slept in the back bedroom for the first week. Irene brought him water and a bowl from the kitchen, which was a thing she had never done for any animal in her life, and she did not make any comment about it, and neither did Caleb. By February, Caleb was running shorter routes, Billings to Sheridan and back mostly, close enough to come on a Thursday. He started coming on Thursdays. Irene made coffee. Sometimes she made the soup she had always made in winter, the one with the barley that his father had eaten every week from October through March for 30 years, which Caleb had not tasted since he was 11 years old and had forgotten entirely until the first Thursday he sat down and she put a bowl in front of him. He ate it without saying anything. She did not comment. Scout lay under the kitchen table with his chin on his paws, entirely at ease, the way dogs are when they have decided a place is theirs. What Caleb Rourke did that November was not extraordinary in the way the word is usually meant. He had the same hours in his day that anyone else had. He had been tired. He had reasons not to stop. He answered a phone call from a woman named Ruth and pointed his truck north. He stayed when staying was uncomfortable. He listened when listening revealed things he would have preferred not to know. He simply did not drive past the smoke. This story is for every person whose name is in a document they didn't sign, and for every person who made a call that someone almost didn't pick up. You know who you are. Is there someone in your life like Irene Rourke? A parent? A neighbor? Someone you've been meaning to check on? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. They deserve to be remembered. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.